America. Tonight, $1 trillion for defense. What have we bought?
Bravo alert! Bravo alert!
This is Dexter Perkins, Alpha Company. Have a Bravo alert.
Damn. What is that?
Bye.
Bravo alert!
Yep.
Did you just get alerted?
Yep.
If you can call me tonight, call me.
Yeah.
Bye.
Later.
Okay.
A company of U.S. Army Rangers has been alerted.
Get that gun for me? Specialized.
Let's go get the stuff outside.
They will move out within hours.
We're going to be moving to a remote staging base. You won't know much between now and the time we move. The alert sequence has been cut down. We'll go wheels up at N+14. Keep it to yourself. At this point, no one in this company should be talking to anyone else on the telephone, seeing anyone outside this company, or outside this compound.
Miller!
What now, Sergeant?
Kirby!
Until they reach their destination, they don't know whether this move is the real thing or a drill. This time, it was a drill. Next time, it could be a strike against terrorists or a hostage rescue mission. Good evening, I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News. That particular Ranger unit is a product of the Reagan defense buildup. But how useful those Rangers may be in the future will depend on the support that they receive from the entire military establishment. And that is a matter of controversy. The Reagan buildup is the largest in peacetime history. And contrary to what many people believe, most of the more than $1 trillion has not gone for nuclear weapons or Star Wars. About 80% of that money has gone to non-nuclear forces like those Rangers. And for the most part, those forces and that money are what we'll be talking about tonight. For better or worse, what we'll get out of this investment will depend on four things. Whether we can solve the problem of inter-service rivalry and competition over defense money, whether we had our priorities right when we spent that $1 trillion, whether we can straighten out our weapons acquisition system to eliminate waste and fraud, and whether we can develop a coherent national strategy. For the past several months now, NBC News correspondent Garrick Utley has been looking into those issues, and here is his report.
The Pentagon, the symbol of American military might, and to most American taxpayers, a mystery. We begin at the beginning of the Reagan administration. It came to Washington and power a little over 6 years ago with a premise and a promise. The premise was that the American military machine had deteriorated seriously. The promise was that it would be fixed, that America would be made great again, as a Reagan campaign slogan prophesied.
During the campaign, I was asked any number of times, if I were faced with a choice of balancing the budget or restoring our national defenses, what would I do? Every time I said restore our defenses, and every time I was applauded.
The first Reagan defense budget was 25% higher than the Carter administration's last one, and that was only the beginning. By 1985, the defense budget had risen to over $286 billion. That's 2.5 times the spending just 7 years earlier. Now, the national mood has changed. Financial and budget realities are being faced. Defense spending has leveled off. So, did we get our money's worth for these $1 trillion? Did we get the kind of armed forces we need for today's world? That is what this program is about. The Pentagon is filled with reminders of past wars and the heroism demonstrated in them. But future wars will most likely be small, against terrorists and guerrillas, the kind of conflict the Army Rangers have been trained to fight. But are they getting the support they need? That's the first issue we face this evening, and for some people, it's a very personal one.
I know he's going to the battalion, but I don't know what he's going to do.
Peggy Van Houten is a Ranger wife. When her husband leaves suddenly at night, the price of national defense is brought home.
He might call me a week from now. He might call me tonight. He might call me tomorrow. You just never know.
The Rangers are part of America's Special Operations Forces, units trained in unconventional warfare. Rangers went into Iran with Delta Force in the unsuccessful attempt to rescue American hostages. It was the Rangers who parachuted into Grenada to spearhead the invasion. A Ranger force is constantly prepared to move anywhere in the world. Platoon Sergeant Kevin Van Houten has been doing this for 5 years. How quickly can you go?
We can go within 18 hours.
Anywhere?
Anywhere.
To be a Ranger wife, you have to be very independent. You have to learn that he's not always there when you need him. You have to do things on your own and just go on, not expect him to be home.
Peggy and Kevin have a 4-year-old son, Michael. Between training, overseas deployments, and periodic readiness alerts, Kevin is often away from home for 3 weeks out of 4.
You're talking to Mommy, ain't you?
No, you.
And when it comes the day Daddy's supposed to be home, Michael is really excited. I mean, sure, there's probably things that Michael's missing out on, but that's Daddy's job.
In addition to the Rangers, the Special Operations Forces include the Army's Green Berets. There are the Navy's SEALs. And the Air Force's Special Operations Wing, and others, trained to fight in small, limited conflicts. But the generals and admirals who run the armed services tend to think of the big war and spend most of their time and money preparing to fight it.
Special Operation Forces fall in a slot. They are not looked on as any part of any particular service, and therefore they don't get the attention that they deserve. It's a good example of the Pentagon at its worst.
Sam Nunn, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee.
You have a Secretary of Defense who gives a clear mandate that they are supposed to have priority. You give the Congress who gives that clear mandate, and I'm sure President Reagan would want them to have priority because they're the most likely forces to be used. What happens year after year after year, they get relegated to the very bottom of the pile on priority.
Another example, the Delta Force, specially trained soldiers showing how they would rescue hostages, the kind of terrorist war the United States already faces. In exercises such as this, the mission is successful. But in the real world, the failure to rescue the American hostages in Tehran was a bitter lesson. Have we learned from it?
We still do not have the airlift that we would need to perform the counter-rescue mission we had in Iran, and that's a disgrace 6 years after we've had a huge buildup in defenses.
Congress, impatient with the neglect of the Special Operations Forces, recently ordered the Pentagon to create a new joint command for the special units to make them less dependent on their parent services. But the defense establishment doesn't like this kind of congressional meddling.
Wouldn't you think it would make more sense to comply with the mandate of Congress as opposed to something that's not in law?
And Congress, in turn, doesn't like the military foot-dragging in implementing the new law.
It is not our intent to hold things up. We are going to comply with the mandate of Congress, I assure you.
The atmosphere in this room shows the adversarial approach to setting defense policy. And you find it inside the Pentagon, too. The corridors are lined with portraits of military leaders of the past, each in the uniform of his service. They represent a military, bureaucratic mindset, which is almost tribal and which has not changed during the Reagan buildup. Each service sees itself fighting not only a would-be enemy, but also competing with other services for defense dollars, for a more important voice in military planning. There is a name for it, inter-service rivalry.
The Navy buys aircraft carriers to pursue its own war. The Air Force
Robert
and the Army are
Comer,
getting lost.
Undersecretary of Defense in the Carter administration.
The Air Force expects to win the war with air power and is basically buying these big bombers so that it can win the whole war. And the Army says the other two services can't possibly do that, that you can't win a war unless you can deploy infantry overseas and hold ground. And the Marines say we don't care how you win the war, but you got to have an amphibious attack.
The rivalry begins at school, at the military academies. Here, an attitude is molded, deeply rooted in tradition, which officers will carry through their careers. The result is a strong esprit de corps, but too often it has led to failures to work and fight together effectively. These troops and machines are part of the Army's Rapid Deployment Forces, which would be sent to the Persian Gulf in case of trouble in that region. The brigade is a good unit, worth the millions it costs to equip, train, and maintain it. But 7 years after President Carter committed the United States to defending the oil fields along the Persian Gulf, we still don't have the planes or ships to move a major force there quickly. General Edward Meyer was Army Chief of Staff from 1979 to 1983.
Why isn't there enough sea lift capability? Why isn't there enough airlift capability?
Because the priorities of the services are basically devoted inward, and they have been in the past. So when the resources are being spent, they're focused on the needs of those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines for whom the chief of the service is responsible. And he doesn't see those elements at the seams that help us project power, that help us increase the capability as being important, or has not in every instance. That's the sea lift, the airlift, the command and control that links it all together because of this focus on service.
Lawrence Korb was an Assistant Secretary of Defense until 1985.
Well, lift, both airlift and sea lift, are missions that are tangential to the main essence of the Navy and the Air Force, because the Navy and the Air Force in the airlift and sea lift business are really lifting the Army and the Marines, and that is not part of their service doctrine. So again, that's an area in which you have to have strong civilian leadership in the Pentagon and in the Congress to force us to do more in that particular area.
A little bit more to your right. Aboard, aboard.
Inter-service rivalry also affects performance on the battlefield. Example, the Air Force is responsible for providing close air support to the Army. That mission is not an Air Force priority, but the Air Force will not give it up and let the Army do it.
You're getting nervous. I told you that when you first pulled up. I said I had the bombs, you had the gun.
The planes used for close air support are getting old, but the Air Force is not interested in developing a plane just to support the Army. It would rather use one of its high-performance fighters, which are not really suitable for ground support. Recently, the Secretary of Defense had to order the Air Force to begin developing a new ground support plane. In Grenada, the three services had trouble even communicating with each other. In one incident, now famous, a soldier had to use his credit card to telephone back to the United States in an effort to get fire support from the Navy ships, which were only a few thousand yards offshore. But ex-Navy Secretary John Lehman, who made his reputation as a tough fighter for the Navy's partisan interests, denies there's a problem.
Oh, that's rubbish. That's such nonsense. I've never seen a town that can take so seriously one or two anecdotes and write vast laws because of a few glib people that run around town telling a story about a soldier in Grenada with a credit card. Inter-service rivalry doesn't amount to that in terms of interfering with a coherent, integrated defense policy.
I think it has been a problem, nothing new, certainly not just in this administration. It goes back to the Spanish-American War. We've had that kind of rivalry for a long time.
The acrimony has persisted. In the wake of the Beirut barracks bombing, Air Force officers sent some wounded servicemen to Air Force hospitals instead of to better prepared Army hospitals. The Air Force decisions resulted in longer travel time for some of the most seriously wounded. An Army memo called the Air Force actions, quote, indefensible, morally, medically, and ethically. Also in Beirut, another example of the service's inability to fight together when it counts. The American Marines at Beirut Airport were being shelled by artillery in the mountains overlooking the Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship New Jersey was ordered to knock out the hostile artillery. Its guns hurled shells the weight of a small car. There was a lot of firing and smoke, but it was useless.
Radars in the area, Army radars, which had been sent over for the Marines to use, were able to identify exactly where those rounds were coming from. There wasn't the ability to pass that information from those radars out to the ship.
It wasn't possible because when the New Jersey was brought out of mothballs and recommissioned, no one thought it important that its guns could receive information from the Army's target locating radar.
We weren't able to direct the 16-inch gun rounds into the target area, so you were firing some undirected rounds, and as a result you had what I call to whom it may concern rounds going out into the area, and you had large Lebanese villages that had major casualties, and so that you started to have a greater disaffection of the civilians in that area.
Incidents like that are unacceptable, and that's why Congress has imposed another major change on the Defense Department in an attempt to force the services to cooperate more closely. The new law increases the authority of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the expense of the individual service chiefs. The Navy fought hardest against the change.
I was opposed to unifying, preventing the president from getting multiple sources of military advice and letting the Secretary of Defense and the President make the final decision. Woe be to this country when we have so aggrandized a non-democratic, uniformed, single man that he has the monopoly view to provide to the President.
Each of the other chiefs now have the right to give dissenting views. We're not trying to stifle military opinion. We want a diversity of views, but we do not want the chairman to be in the historical role of having to get everybody to agree before he makes a presentation as to the joint position. That is the lowest common denominator approach, and it has failed year after year after year to produce good, sound military advice.
There was not a consolidated approach toward what the military really needed in order to respond to the challenges we face today. We had a lot of different parochial aspects that resulted in one force being stronger than another, resulted in forces being unable to talk to one another, and we weren't getting the maximum amount of defense for every dollar we spent as a result of the way we were going about doing business.
The new law strengthening the chairman of the Joint Chiefs could be one of the most important reforms to hit the Pentagon, or it could be another casualty of tradition and inertia.
Far be it from me to ever say that the Pentagon can't slow anything down that the Pentagon sets out to slow down. It can. There will be bureaucratic fighting, there'll be backbiting, there'll be resistance, but the man at the top's got a lot of authority now.
And the military has a lot of new, expensive weapons, but are they the right kind of weapons? That when we continue. In 1980, the American people, or at least a majority of the voters, wrote a blank check for defense. The attitude here at the Pentagon was spend it while you've got it. Commit Congress and the country to new weapons systems and spending programs so that by, say, 1987, it would be difficult and expensive to cancel them. It was all done very quickly without a clear setting of priorities. When the Reagan buildup began, the money flowed. Each branch of the military had its wish list, and it seemed just about all of the wishes could come true. The Army began a modernization program. New tanks, new personnel carriers, helicopters, guns, radios, even a new bayonet that doubles as a can opener. The admirals started building their 600-ship Navy, building it around large aircraft carrier battle groups. And the New Jersey was only one of 3 World War II battleships which have been reactivated, armed with cruise missiles, and sent to join the fleet.
I hereby place the United States ship New Jersey in commission. God bless and Godspeed.
And the Air Force got its share too. The B-1 bomber program, killed by the Carter administration, was revived by President Reagan.
And what an airplane.
It may turn out to be his Edsel. Only later, much later, did the Air Force admit that the electronics jamming and counter-jamming systems, which are crucial, don't work. And no one can say with certainty when they will be fixed or how much it will cost to fix them. There have also been problems with the terrain-following radar, fuel tank leaks, and the missile launching system. Yet at Dyess Air Force Base in Texas, when the B-1 was officially put on operational status, there were assurances that all was ready.
The bomber is ready for launch right now. We could be airborne in a matter of minutes.
Question: why did the Air Force and the administration damage their credibility by insisting the bomber was ready to go when it wasn't?
It was pushed by this administration as a way in which to show the Soviets that a new team was here, a team intent up on building military strength. And we took an aircraft that was kind of developed in the 70s. We tried to load it with 80s technology, and in many ways we may have gotten the worst of all possible worlds.
Cap Weinberger raised some very serious questions about the B-1, but I think the political campaign commitments overwhelmed the evidence at that time. Not to say the B-1 won't have some useful purpose, but it will. It can be used over a period of time as a standoff bomber, cruise missile carrier, but we paid for a tremendous amount of money for a capability for that bomber to be able to penetrate Soviet airspace, to be able to fly over the target, and an awful lot of that money is down the tube, I think.
Well, how much of this trillion-plus dollar buildup could end up down the tubes?
I think the people, the American people, got their money's worth for about the first 2 or 3 years, because you'll recall that back in the late 70s that we truly had a hollow army.
And what happened then?
And then, as you started to take care of the things that were broken within the Army and fix those in the Navy and the Air Force and Marine Corps and fix those, then the competing priorities started to come to fore, such as the strategic systems versus conventional versus unconventional versus counterterrorism. And there did not appear to be a clear prioritization at that point in time as to where the resources should be allocated.
Without clear priorities, the buildup has become uneven. Example: the Army's 11th Cavalry Regiment patrols the East German border. It is a select unit, high on the priority list for modernization. If war comes in Germany, the 11th Cavalry will be the first American unit to fight. As part of the recent buildup, the regiment has received new M1 tanks, each with a price tag of $2.2 million. Also, the new Bradley, an armored personnel carrier. Each of them costs $1.4 million. Both vehicles have revolutionary gun sights which enable them to see targets at night or in bad weather. The Army's strategy calls for tanks, armored personnel carriers, and missile-firing helicopters to fight together as a team. But the regiment's attack helicopters are only effective in daylight and good weather. The commander of the 11th Cavalry knows what that means.
That represents a significant disadvantage to us because we've made a tremendous investment in the rest of the equipment that the regiment has, the tanks and the Bradleys, to give us a night capability. We think in tanks and Bradleys and ground systems that we enjoy a tremendous advantage over the Soviets at night, and we would seek combat at night with the Soviets to exploit that advantage. But the attack helicopter, which is vital to our combined arms capability, is still a daytime-only system.
The result is $350 million worth of modern armored vehicles in this regiment alone, which lack the supporting helicopters needed to fight most effectively.
In my view, it's because the overarching strategy, which links together all of the dollars that we spend, hadn't been as clearly thought out, as clearly articulated down to the services as necessary in order to ensure that you were spending it for forces that could, in fact, be cohesive in battle.
So what was the basis for making decisions on whether to build more aircraft carriers or more planes? Was it ad hoc? Was it hit and miss, or?
Well, the basis was that things were so bad and we had so many areas to fix up, and there was certainly a modicum of truth to that, that you could put it in every area. Now, as long as the money was plentiful, then that was a sensible way to do things. But when resources became constrained, as they inevitably did, then you had no basis on which to make the hard choices.
Well, what does this mean, the fact that there's going to be less money available for these big programs that have been started? What does that mean for the defense budget for the military?
It means, first of all, you may not have the resources to properly support all of the weapons that you bought in the first part of this decade. We bought lots of planes and ships and tanks. Now we need to go out and buy what we call the infrastructure. We have to get the men and women to man those systems. We have to have the bases to support them. We have to buy spare parts to fix them. We have to buy ammunition to put on these weapon systems.
The Pentagon has already had to make deep cuts in the amount of ammunition it planned to buy. Less money means hard choices. It can also mean higher prices. Orders for the Navy's new electronic warfare plane have been cut in half. The result is that the cost of each plane will be $22 million higher than originally planned.
We would have been much better off if we'd had 5% growth, 4% growth over 6-7 years than this roller coaster of 12% growth when the acquisition system really wasn't ready for that kind of growth, and when the result has been now that we've started far too many weapon systems for the amount of resources that are available.
And the weapons can be no better than the people using them. Getting good people into uniform has been a success of the Reagan buildup. In 1980, only about 65% of recruits in the Army had a high school diploma. Today, more than 90% do. All the services are happy with the all-volunteer system. They have no desire to bring back the draft. But they are bringing in more women. They are about 13% of new recruits. At this anti-aircraft missile site near the East German border, 20% of the soldiers are women. Captain Laura Bay is one of the officers.
The soldiers have very hard duty up here. I lost Alpha system. They pull their own guard. They man their systems. They have to go to training after they've been up here for 24 hours. They have an extremely difficult job.
Their job could lead to combat. In case of war, it would take Soviet planes about 30 seconds to reach these missiles. The soldiers would be a prime target.
There's no doubt in my mind that I'm in a frontline unit.
In our van, sometimes, from the frequencies, we pick up East German stations, Czechoslovakian stations, and you hear this foreign language, and you're like, wait a minute, what's going on? The first time I came up here, that happened. It gets pretty scary sometimes.
When it comes to spending money, there is nothing the military does which is more controversial and open to criticism than the way it buys weapons and equipment and what we end up spending for them. The story of the AWACS plane and a piece of plastic worth about 26 cents, which ended up costing the Air Force more than $900. When we continue.
This NBC News report on America will continue.
Each year, the military spends about $100 billion to buy weapons and equipment, such as this AWACS surveillance and command plane.
05 at 5 o'clock, 10 miles.
The weapons are so complex, the cost so astronomical, that the average citizen can't comprehend the system and so ignores what's happening. Until someone comes along and confronts the system with common sense. That's what Sergeant William Kessler did. In 1983, he noticed that the plastic caps on 2 folding stools needed to be replaced. He ordered 2 caps. When he received the bill, the price was $1,118.26 for each cap. He had a very human reaction.
I said, not today, not for the price they wanted.
Boeing, which makes the AWACS, was charging the Air Force $916 for the plastic cap. The Air Force then added a handling charge and billed Sergeant Kessler's unit more than $1,100. The sergeant challenged the system. This is the old one, which cost a small fortune. This is the one you use today. And the difference?
About $1,100.
What does this cost today?
28 cents.
28 cents. The Air Force can get the plastic caps for 28 cents because it now asks for competitive bids. The Pentagon is demanding more competition for its business, but over 40% of military contracts are still offered on a non-competitive basis. So defense spending can be highly profitable, and it has been frequently abused. The Pentagon's Inspector General reports that of the 100 largest defense contractors, 59, more than half, are being investigated for fraud. Some of the nation's biggest corporations have lied, cheated, and overcharged. In March 1987, TRW admitted to defrauding the Pentagon by filing up to $23 million in false billings. Martin Marietta Corporation pleaded guilty to fraudulently withholding $1 million in rebates due the military. In 1986, Litton Industries paid $15 million in civil and criminal penalties for inflating charges on defense contracts. In 1985, GE was fined $1 million for filing false claims on a defense contract. Even those who work in the Pentagon agree the system is a mess.
The acquisition system that has evolved in this country since the war is virtually unworkable.
We have a combination of a free economy system and a subsidized system, which is the worst of both worlds. And then on top of that, we have layered a whole host of requirements, regulations, bureaucracy.
Despite the regulations, the system continues to produce blunders like the $600 toilet seat built for a Navy patrol bomber.
So it outrages me when we have another example of spare parts being purchased at a price that's gouging the taxpayer.
The House will be in order.
Pentagon officials blame Congress for a large part of the mess, call it the politics of defense. Example, congressmen from coal-producing states this year forced the Pentagon to buy 300,000 tons of coal. That's over 2/3 more than the military can use. $15 million wasted, plus whatever it cost the Pentagon to store all that unused coal. But it's not likely we'll hear of any congressional committees investigating that kind of waste. And this is the T-46A, the Fairchild trainer aircraft that shut down the federal government. October 17th, 1986. Across the country, millions of government workers went home early because the government had run out of money. That was the result of a filibuster by 2 New York senators. They were trying to force the Air Force to change its decision not to buy the plane. The trainer, of course, would have been built in their state.
We're not debating an airplane. The Air Force doesn't want it.
It's now been 21 hours and 40 minutes since we've been on this issue.
How much money was wasted by shutting down the government? Who knows? It's all part of the system.
Senate will come to order.
And so is this. This is the Army Proving Ground in Aberdeen, Maryland. One of the peculiarities of the American military system is the extent to which an armed service which conceives, develops, and buys a weapon also tests it. Critics say that is a basic flaw, that it can and has led to inadequate testing and expensive mistakes. During the 1973 Middle East War, the hydraulic fluid in American-made planes and tanks used by the Israelis was disastrously flammable when hit by enemy fire. The United States Air Force set out to develop a safer fluid. Retired Colonel James Burton told us how that fluid was tested.
Laboratory tests. Put a bunch in a pan and light a match to it. If it didn't burn, or if it didn't burn as often as the old stuff, then it was considered less flammable.
The Air Force was convinced that the new fluid was better, so it was accepted for use in the Army's M1 tanks, M113 personnel carriers, the Navy's F-14, and the Air Force's F-15 fighter planes, and other planes and vehicles. But Colonel Burton, then director of the Pentagon's live fire test program, insisted on more realistic tests, such as these, using live ammunition and actual hydraulic systems.
Twice as many fires started with the new stuff in the test as with the old stuff. And the old stuff was already accepted as very bad. It's an example of how inadequate testing has led us down the wrong path.
Then there was the case of the Army's new anti-aircraft gun, the notorious DIVAD. $1.8 billion were spent on it before it was abandoned. Why was so much money wasted on a weapon which didn't work? There were accusations that tests were rigged in order to mislead the administration and Congress about the DIVAD's performance.
There's a radar-directed gun, and the radar is supposed to be able to detect a target, a helicopter hovering at ground level, close to the ground,
and train the gun on it and shoot the helicopter. And this one day they tried it and it missed. Couldn't hit the helicopter. So the next day they put a radar reflector on the helicopter.
To help it along.
To help that's right, to help it along. And they tried again. Still couldn't hit. And the next day they put 4 on, which really helped it along. And they finally hit it, and it blew it up.
The testing that was done was not rigorous and reported in a candid fashion.
Jack Krings heads a new office at the Pentagon, which is supposed to strengthen the testing of new weapons systems.
Unfortunately, these systems tend to get a support base within the service as well as the contractor. And therefore, the service individual responsible for it feels that it's his job to get it from phase A to phase B, one way or another. So consequently, he isn't necessarily looking for impediments to progress.
And one of the most frustrating things about the system is that no one seems to be held responsible, even in the case of the DIVAD, where nearly $2 billion were wasted. General Edward Meyer was Army Chief of Staff at the time.
How do you feel personally when something like this happens?
You're absolutely irate at the system. You're irate at yourself for not having been smart enough to anticipate it ahead of time. You know that now, it's not just the money that's lost. It's all the soldiers that are going to have to go off to war without air defense if you go to war tomorrow. The system is so big and so bureaucratic that almost all the decisions are made by committee. And there isn't any one person that you could really point your finger at and say, okay, you're the guy and you're the one that was responsible for it and failed to see that it works when we got it, and so you're out.
Every administration says that it's going to fix the military acquisition system, and the Reagan administration has made some progress. The problem, though, is not with individuals, but with the system itself. The Mutual Interest Society formed by the armed services, defense contractors, and Congress. If there is no single solution, at least there are some ideas where to begin.
But the only idea I've come up with is to copy every other country. The French, the British, the Germans, the Italians, and the Russians. And to have an independent defense purchasing agency. In our country is the only one in which the services do the R&D, the contracting, and everything else. And I think that to get at the guts of the problem, you've got to take it away from the services and set it up as part of the Secretary of Defense's office.
That seems quite simple. Logical, even.
Yeah, but it isn't done.
Why?
Well, the defense contractors don't want it. They don't want a tougher operation to deal with. The services fight, bleed, and die against it. This is once again part of service particularism. We don't have a defense department.
And there are knowledgeable people, experts, who say we don't have a defense strategy, that more is not necessarily better. Where do we go from here? That when we continue. As of tonight, the Reagan administration has spent approximately $1.4 trillion on defense. That the United States needs a strong defense system goes without saying. That it needs the kind of system we have bought is being challenged. In short, do we have a strategy to match the weapons? That's the question that has been debated here in this room before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger.
Because our defense needs are compelled by Soviet aggression. And changing our strategy is not going to change the Soviet intentions or the Soviet capabilities. Our strategy is still to deter aggression by our capacity to respond to it. And the only alternatives to a strategy of credible response to aggression are early capitulation, early escalation, or the abandonment of our allies and our interests.
But that definition is not precise enough for Senator Sam Nunn, who called these hearings.
Even the President's Blue Ribbon Commission on Defense Management, chaired by David Packard, had serious questions about the adequacy of our current strategy making. The Commission's report states, and I quote from that Packard Commission, "There is no rational system whereby the executive branch and the Congress reach coherent and enduring agreement on national military strategy, the forces to carry it out, and the funding that should be provided in light of the overall economy and competing claims on national resources," end quote.
An example of that has been the dramatic growth of the Navy during the Reagan buildup. A 600-ship fleet, to be exact. That's the number of ships the Navy expects to have by 1990. And it includes the heart of the Navy's maritime strategy, 15 aircraft carrier battle groups. Each of those battle groups is built around a large carrier. The carrier costs about $3.4 billion. The planes it carries are worth another $4 billion. To protect the carrier, there is usually one or more nuclear attack submarines. There are 2 cruisers, plus assorted destroyers and frigates, and a number of logistics support ships carrying fuel, supplies, and ammunition. Add it all up, and each battle group costs about $17 billion. The Navy argues that big carriers are the best way to project American military power around the world. Critics say they are too expensive and too vulnerable. But in the rivalry for defense dollars, the Navy has the biggest guns.
The Navy has always been the most autonomous, the most independent, but that's understandable. The Navy has been very resistant, and few secretaries of defense have been willing to put the Navy in its place. Now look at Weinberger and John Lehman. I mean, John Lehman has run rings around Weinberger and getting money, and getting ships.
There are people who will say that you are fighting to defend the autonomy, if not the parochialism, of an individual branch of the armed services.
I've been here for 6 years, and I've seen no infighting for resources.
How can you say that? Everybody in town is saying you're the biggest, toughest infighter that exists in this town for resources.
Yeah, but I haven't had to fight the other services. I have to fight Congress and the committees up there. We do have to fight all the time the various levels of the bureaucracy that oppose virtually every initiative we do. That's where the infighting comes on, and of course we have to be good infighters.
I'd like to see more money come to the Army.
There has to be a better way. There is a growing awareness that the United States cannot afford to have its military options determined by which service has the political skills to sell its favorite weapon systems. Each dollar, or $17 billion, spent on a carrier battle group is money which can't be spent on other essentials. On the special units to fight the most likely conflicts we face. On planes to move our forces quickly to where they would have to fight. On equipment which would enable expensively restored battleships to support troops on shore more effectively.
Clean out the 1-5, we've got 2 targets.
On new communication systems which would allow the 3 services to talk to each other more dependably. Even as the Navy pushes towards its goal of a 600-ship fleet, including 2 new aircraft carriers, there is concern that there won't be enough money to man them. 30,000 additional sailors will be needed in just the next 4 years.
Unless we're going to deplete the Marine Corps, the tactical side of the Air Force, and the Army to the point of really an unbalanced defense picture, that naval force is not going to be able to be adequately manned or adequately equipped in the future because we've simply gotten it out of balance.
But when we ask what we can afford to spend on defense, we are also asking what are the limits of American power. That is something the Reagan administration has found difficult to recognize.
But to this glib, academic, trendy line that one hears around the think tanks here in Washington, that we must bring our strategy into line with our resources. It's not the esoteric thing that these parlor room Pershings in Washington like to make it. It is simply applying rigorous logic to the resources we have to do the tasks that are given to us by the reality of day-to-day life.
But the new reality is that the resources, the budget increases defense planners had counted on are not there. It is time to concentrate the mind.
It's a point in history where I believe it is possible with a nonpartisan group to be able to look at the broad picture and try to articulate a strategy which could be accepted by the administration and by Congress. And then there would be a basis upon which the administration submitted its request for resources and a basis upon which Congress allocated its resources.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
There was a time when President Reagan could walk into Congress, ask for just about anything he wanted for defense, and get it.
It's the only department in our entire program that will actually be increased over the present budgeted figure.
But no longer. Public support for big increases in defense spending is no longer there.
The Congress cut defense requests by $85 billion in the last 3 years.
For the President and Congress, the time has come for a simple idea, to agree on long-term priorities on how we spend our defense dollars. Some thoughts about that in a moment. Trying to understand our defense system, let alone deal with it, can be an exercise in humility. It is so big, apparently so uncontrollable, that most people give up trying, except it's so expensive we can't afford to. In our report this evening, 3 problems have stood out which need our attention. First, a more consistent, stable way of providing funds for the military. The up and down defense budget roller coaster defies sensible planning and invites waste. Second, greater civilian control over the individual services, so they will serve overall defense needs rather than their particular interests. And third, a defense strategy. That involves more than how to use guns, planes, and aircraft carriers. It also means understanding what we can afford. The expensive military buildup has contributed to the unprecedented federal deficits which threaten the economic health of our nation. That, too, is what we have bought for $1 trillion. I'm Garrett Utley. Good night.
During the campaign, I was asked any number of times, if I were faced with a choice of balancing the budget or restoring our national defenses, what would I do? Every time I said restore our defenses, and every time I was applauded.